The only people who don't want to disclose the truth are people with something to hide.
Without further ado, again, we're talking about back-to-back favorites. Moments ago, we just spoke with Robert Spencer from Jihad Watch. Please say good morning. Welcome back. Jerry Corsi, one of our true favorites. Mr. Corsi, good morning. Welcome back to the radio show.
Peter, great to be back with you. Thank you.
I want to tell you something that's happened, and I want to get your take on it. And then we're going to talk about the Obama attorney now being the new FCC watchdog. What's your take on Bill O'Reilly?
Well, I've always considered Bill O'Reilly to be not a conservative, not a true conservative, but a moderate. And in many ways, if you look at Bill O'Reilly's past broadcasting and history, he was much more of an investigative reporter when he was young. I'll give you an example I was very aware of. For instance, when he was, coming up, he did a lot of stories investigating the Kennedy assassination and pursued many of the avenues of others being involved other than Lee Harvey Oswald, the many issues regarding the intelligence agencies and the testimony that's come out in Congress, etc. Now that he's Bill O'Reilly, Fox News, making millions of dollars, the book Killing Kennedy tells the traditional story that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone assassin. So Bill O'Reilly moves towards conventional thinking, much more than I think a true conservative would, and is much more interested in making sure he has his access to interview the Obama White House, which he doesn't ask the really tough questions when he gets the opportunity.
I tell you this, and I've never been a fan. He worked here under the name of Bill Riley.
Right.
And I know too much private life stuff, but that's an
aside.
Well,
I know a lot of the private life stuff, too, and I was avoiding that because it's not pretty, but it does reveal a personality that most people don't know anything about.
I agree. Well, we had this really interesting experience, and you can go to our website, 710knus.com, and it links over to a weekly newspaper, Westward. It's a very good paper, and they've beaten me up more than once, and when I've had it coming. And I had this really crazy experience, and I can make the case for you by playing the phone call that we got from O'Reilly's producer. And he called Casey. He names himself, gives a phone number and all this good stuff. And he says, Bill wants to talk about Colorado and the future of Colorado. And he actually billboarded it on a show 2 days ago that last night was going to be about Colorado, about marijuana. So they contacted us. And, Casey, when you set that up, we can play that for Dr. Corsi. So the guy calls me at the house, and let's first of all play this for Dr. Corsi. Can we do this, case? All right. This is 2 days ago. The phone call comes like this.
Hey, Casey. Chad Blake passed along your information from the radio station. My name is Tom Fox. I work with the O'Reilly Factor at Fox News Channel. Doing a segment on tomorrow's show about the state of Colorado. And Bill's premise that they've kind of taken a liberal turn over the past few years, and we're looking to talk to a couple of people from the state about, where they think the state is going, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, that kind of thing. And Peter's name came up as a guest that might be good for this. It would be tomorrow, Wednesday, at 3 p.m. your time, 5 p.m. Eastern. It's our lead story, so just kind of wanted to feel things out, see if maybe he'd be interested.
He goes on to get phone numbers. I don't want to do the phone number thing on the air. We're trying to contact him and see if they'll come on as guests. But he tells us it's the lead story for last night's show. And so the young fellow calls me, nice enough, and like I say, you can read all of this at 710knus.com, and it links over to the Westward article. These are for folks in our audience as well. And one guy called me a liar. I just played the tape. He said it never happened. I said, well, there's the tape. So this kid calls me at the house, nice kid. And he first talks about, I kept my notes in front of him because I think this is going to get good. And he talked about Jessica's Law, and they write about that, and O'Reilly wants Jessica's Law. And then he brings up, and he talks about Colorado's future. And I went over about all the recalls we've been involved with getting rid of John Morris and Angie Harone, and we made this other all state senator tap out, Evie Hudak, and just all these different things about what happened in the election and how Bloomberg funds everything that was happening here, and the traditional truth. And then he brings up marijuana. Well, I am for legalization, And I made it clear to him, I'm sober, but I talked about the history of prohibition and the European-style gangs, and now we have these horrible, and I named them, and I'm fairly good at this. I've read about it and talked to a lot of people, but La Familia, Norteños, Sereños,
Right.
MS-13, the Emmys, all this kind of stuff. And I said, they're far worse than Capone or the Purple Gang or the White Hand or, anything else. So all of a sudden he says to me, well, we're thinking about doing another segment next week. And I paused him, and I said, pardon me? He said, well, now next week. And I said, you called me up about tomorrow. Well, next week and I said, I'm paraphrasing here, but I said, why don't you have the, I'll say the word stones. I said, why don't you have the balls, pardon me, to just tell me you don't want me on the show. Well, next week we're talking about another segment. I said, no, just tell me right now that you don't want me on the show because I disagree with Mr. O, and I got a pretty good convincing argument, I think, on legalization. Well, now next week we're looking at another segment, and I said, you know what? Why don't you tell that fake Irishman, first of all, Obama's birth certificate is jive, and I got about that far, and they hung up on me.
Right.
So what I said, and I was interviewed by a reporter about this yesterday, and what I said, I find it fascinating that all O'Reilly does, now he's become, tonight his guest is Valerie Jarrett, if you can imagine that.
Right.
And what a laydown. And do you believe this, by the way, Jerry, you've been around this stuff as long, if not longer than me. Do you believe when he sat down at the halftime of the Super Bowl, Obama knew every question he was going to ask?
Most likely, yes.
Yeah, okay.
I'm sure that they interviewed O'Reilly before the interview with the president and made sure they knew where O'Reilly was headed.
Yeah.
They didn't know the specific questions.
I agree.
They knew the topics and the areas.
No, I agree. They knew generally what he was going to say.
You're not going to be allowed to ask a hard-hitting or snipe question of a president by the White House staff. They're not going to permit it.
Remember when Rather did that to George W.? And,
oh, sure.
Yeah, and not to George W., but H.W., George 41. He tried to ambush him, and and O'Reilly sent a crew here to ambush a local critic in the Denver Post by the name of Joey Nostra. They jumped her in the parking lot with a camera.
Right.
Okay, fair game. I'm not against that kind of stuff.
Right.
But so last night I watched the first part of the show, and Casey taped the whole thing. Now, we were told it was their lead story. They didn't even talk about marijuana until this really goofy segment with some woman. And they billboarded they were going to talk about Colorado.
Right.
What do you do with all of that? Doc, what would you do with
that?
Well,
you got to realize, increasingly even Fox News is more to the center. One of the agendas of the Obama administration is to pound Fox News regularly whenever it's critical of the president or whenever it articulates a true conservative position. Because take a look at the recent effort by the FCC to do this study on, media. Now, if you really get behind it, and we've got an article on WND about it right now, Aaron Klein did an excellent piece. The FCC is being guided by one of these typical leftist studies like the Center for American Progress would produce, and they're doing a lot of the agenda for the White House and the media today. So the argument is, okay, now if we're going to have a nation in which an increasing number of people are poor, on food stamps, broken families, etc., the media has got to not just talk about international politics and the deficit and all these nasty issues which don't sound too good. Let's get some articles out here about and some coverage about, what's happening in food stamps and how you use your food stamps program and where you get your welfare and how that's going. Let's do some articles that really are the diversity articles. Now, that gets pounded enough by the bureaucrats who are in charge of the agenda, and it filters down into the media that if the media doesn't begin covering these subjects, the media is not going to be favored with licensing and other issues that the government's in control of.
That's access.
And then the left has developed a tactic very effectively of going to, they do two things. One, we just exposed it as well. They have now all these Obots, the Obamas, all the bloggers who are trolls. Everybody's on these websites posting things. increasing number is being directed by the White House and by the administration. We're developing evidence. Even some of these trolls have White House IP addresses, where their whole goal is an intelligence agency disinformation to get in trash threads or investigations or reporting that are counter to the narrative the leftist administration wants to advance. And so, we're headed into a more socialist mentality in terms of income inequality does not just mean that, the Obama administration is worried about people making less money. It means that we've got to lower the nature of media. We've got to lower the nature of public focus, public policy to serve the needs of this increasingly poor and uneducated population. If the stories aren't at that level, if that's not diversity, what percentage of your broadcasting was Latino? What percentage of your broadcasting was African American? Does that reflect the community? Does it reflect their interests? That's the new fairness standard. And the administration, and Bill O'Reilly reflects this, because Bill O'Reilly is very attuned to one thing, I believe, and that's maintaining Bill O'Reilly's income.
Well,
and he's not going to be the star on Fox or draw an audience unless he has this center of the road kind of approach where he says, the spin stops here.
Yeah.
Well, all along, it's a particular spin of his own kind.
No, I agree. I mean, like I said, the private life stuff. I
know all of that stuff.
I do too.
I know more of the true O'Reilly than I really want to go into on the radio because some of it is not very pretty.
No, it's not. And
it's also very contrary to the image he likes to project on television.
I know when I was working over at Clear Channel at KHW when we first met, and there was a lot of really good wired-in guys into the New York scene, and at the time, my boss, the programmer director at the time, was Chris Olinger, and Chris had visited into New York because they were carrying Limbaugh on KOA, and she went into New York and came back with all of these amazing stories about O'Reilly and the payoffs and the sexual harassment and the cop and his wife and all that kind of stuff. And I went, wow. And I knew him here when he was Bill Riley before he put the O on it. Right. And he was generally perceived as, if he could bully you, he would. And I'm just fascinated by this guy. So I have watched his show from last night. And tonight he has, of all people, Valerie Jarrett. You and I could be old dead men and never get an opportunity to speak with Valerie Jarrett.
Well, and if we did, it'd be cut off right away because the kinds of questions we would ask, she doesn't want to be confronted with. And that's, you've got Podesta now inside the Obama White House forming policy. I might as well just start ordering all the Center American Progress reports and reading them because that's where they're going.
If you get a moment.
And these are social justice orientation, which is a warmed-over leftism. I want to say one more thing,
Surely.
Peter. I come from an old school of journalism, which goes back even to the training from before World War II. I was trained by the World War II generation. And the training I got is that, the job of journalists are always to be the watchdogs, to report Republican and Democrat, not partisan, both sides, investigate, report, expose. And the assumption was, I didn't really fully appreciate it at the time, the assumption was you had a literate and educated population that was following the news. I mean, here we just had, I'm wondering, we had a Russian warship that docked in Cuba.
Yeah, I saw that in Havana, like the old days.
Okay. Yeah. And now, in John Kennedy's day, this would have been a sensation. It would have been on the New York Times. Everybody would have, these are the kinds of steps that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis one by one. But today, do you think anybody is asking hard questions to the New York Times about Putin's reaction to Obama over the Ukraine? Well, that has anything to do with a Russian warship showing up in Cuba?
We had a great guest in the first segment, and I think you know him, Robert Spencer. And there's a line, and I'm finding myself at this age falling into the philosophy of history. There's a great line, and the Durants were incredibly gifted, and so many of these great.
Yes, they were.
You Taylor Roper and all these guys. And this line says, "When there is a carcass, the vultures will gather."
Right.
And you can see that Vladimir Putin and perhaps 3/4 of the world has no respect for Barack Obama. And I agree with you. I mean, this is somewhat of a different Russia, but what Jack Kennedy did was he brought in, he used the Truman Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, and they dropped it right on top of Nikita Khrushchev.
Right.
And you're right. I mean, I saw that story this morning about there's not a Soviet, but it's a Russian warship, and it's in Havana.
Right.
They can't be up to any good. I mean,
well, and again, you know, the fact is, if you want to talk about the Middle East, what also went unreported and continues to is that the so-called Arab Spring was not a democracy movement. It was a movement in which the Muslim Brotherhood took over.
Of course.
Countries like Libya are now dominated by Al-Qaeda, and we are supporting Al-Qaeda.
Oh, sure. I mean, as moments ago, Robert.
Especially in Syria, we're arming Al-Qaeda and other radical Islamic. And in Egypt, we cut off aid because Egypt is prosecuting the Muslim Brotherhood.
I mean, moments ago, Robert Spencer said, you know, those weapons are, you know, they reappear all these different places. And as Mr. Spencer has said, the same guys that 6 months earlier had been trying to kill American GIs in Afghanistan were pushing Gaddafi out, and we supported them. And this is Mrs. Clinton. This was before John Kerry, and it's insane.
I advise you to go get when I wrote What Went Wrong, my book, I really tried to do an analysis of this. I've been following a lot of the Democratic consultants and demographers, a guy named Ray Texiera.
Sure.
Okay, there's an Obama coalition and beyond in the 2012 election, which has been very little read by conservatives. And what it points out is that Obama achieved victory by carrying 93% of African-American voters, 71% of Latino, 73% of Asian, and only 39% of white voters, slightly less than former presidential candidate Michael Dukakis' share of the white vote in 1988. Now, say, why is this possible? They say because of the shifting demographic composition of the electorate. The rising percentages of people of color, unmarried, working women, millennial generation, and secular voters, educated whites living in more urbanized states. What you're dealing with is a reconstruction of the FDR coalition hard edge, where the Democratic Party has decided by adding together the votes of minorities and people of color, and focusing on the cities, dealing with unmarried women who are looking for assistance, and millennials who can't find jobs because the jobs have been sent over to China and other places by free trade agreements and aren't coming back, that the Democratic Party has locked in a permanent presidential electoral majority, which even states like Colorado, where I lived, and I know westward, and you control the Front Range, you control Colorado. You control Denver, you control Colorado Springs, 3 or 4 cities along the Front Range, and it doesn't matter what the rest of Colorado votes because there's not enough people there. And the rest of Colorado is largely conservative. Take California. There's a thin stretch along the coast that is urbanized and leftist. The majority of the counties in California are red counties. They're conservative, but there's not enough people living in them to make a difference.
Sure, it's the vote. Let me do this because of a hard break coming. Perkins Coie was the law firm that was Barack Obama's guy. And
Perkins Coie,
pardon me. I'm sorry, I apologize. And this is the story of the woman who, and I do not believe she brought anything back from Hawaii on that night flight. I believe it was already manufactured by the kid I call Jimmy down the hall. But now this law firm has now resurfaced. Take 2 minutes, Dr. Corsi, and we'll get you back first part of next week. What is their job now? And by the way, aren't they, interestingly enough, of all places, they're out of Seattle, are they not?
They're out of Seattle. They're a watchdog leftist firm. They also have Anita Dunn, who is the wife of Robert Bauer, who's one of the senior partners, the closest to the Obama administration. Anita Dunn had to resign in the early days of the Obama administration first term because of her vicious attacks against Fox. That was the beginning. Her influence is still there. Now the firm, Perkins Coie, Robert Bauer, after having done the dirty work of the cover-up on the Obama birth certificate, is deeply involved in the going after any television station that will broadcast an anti-Obama commercial, television commercial, against the Democrat. Because what the left is afraid of, what the hard left is afraid of, is that, especially after Citizens United, there'll be a lot of funding of attack ads against Democrats who voted for Obamacare. And the Democrats are deeply worried, and I think appropriately so, that Obamacare is going to cost a debacle for the Democratic Party in the 2014 election. That's a lower turnout voting election. It's going to be tough to get these Democratic constituents, which I've just identified, to go to the polls in the same numbers in a presidential election. And there's going to be more rigorous attempt by conservatives to police voter fraud that the Democrats, I believe, are using to get about 5% additional voting margin in every state they're operating in. So, these tactics that the Democrats are using are becoming transparent now, and the programs of the socialist programs, the weak element of socialism has always been, how do you pay for it? You can all have all these great promises, but in the end, when everybody is on the government dole and under government control, who's paying for it?
That's why it's
never worked. It's a great lie. It's a great promise. The government will take care of you. Free medical care, free food, free education, free.
Yeah.
Well, free means low quality, and it means controlled by the government. And it means, you're dumbing down. You might as well become a slave, because ultimately, if you object to raise your hand and don't like the system, you're going to be the Robert Bowers and the FCC will come to police you to get your message to be turned off.
You become that
And that's
guy.
a lot of what this is about. It's the whole discussion about O'Reilly. It's control of the message, which the left is now in overgear. They've got between now and the end of the Obama administration to try to get this Podesta Center for American Progress agenda put fully in place and to switch the country, instead of themes about building wealth and economic progress and growth, start talking about income inequality and social justice and diversity, which are a set of themes that you trace it back. I go right back to socialism.
Doc, I'm right at my break, and I always like that line. If you like your free press, you can keep it, right?
Right.
Yeah.
The only people who don't want to disclose the truth are people with something to hide.